Tonight, we're taking a journey into the surprisingly strange, occasionally itchy, and sometimes downright alarming world of medieval sleep. If you've ever thought your sleep schedule was a mess, just remember, people in the Middle Ages would look at your 8 hours of uninterrupted rest the same way you might look at someone voluntarily sleeping in a bus station. Which, in their defense, they sometimes did. Picture it, the year is somewhere between 1100 and whenever the Black Death is due to make your village's acquaintance. The sun has set, the fire is dying, and the only source of light in your house is the faint glow of your neighbor's goat chewing on something it probably shouldn't. Electricity, non-existent. Netflix, also non-existent. Unless you count listening to your uncle tell the same hunting story for the 7th night in a row, without artificial light. Medieval people followed what's called a segmented sleep cycle, or, as modern science might call it, sleeping like a confused raccoon. The idea was simple. You went to bed soon after dark, drifted into what they called first sleep for about 4 hours, then woke up on purpose in the middle of the night for what we'll call the watch. This wasn't insomnia. It was the plan. People used this wakeful interlude to pray, stoke the fire, check on livestock, or, let's just say, tend to marital relations. Apparently, there's nothing more romantic than whispering sweet nothings while a chicken looks on disapprovingly from the corner. Why did they do this? Without bright lamps to force your body into a fake daytime, your circadian rhythm naturally creates 2 shorter sleep periods instead of one big chunk. It's your brain's way of saying, let's take a break halfway through and see if the goats are still in the yard. Modern research has even suggested that segmented sleep might actually be healthier for some people, but in the Middle Ages, it wasn't a choice. It was the rhythm of life. Monks, farmers, and even nobles all did it. If you were awake at 2 a.m., no one thought it was strange. They might even drop by for a chat, which is awkward if you're in the middle of your marital tending. After this wakeful period, people slipped back into second sleep, which lasted until sunrise. And let's be honest, with drafty walls, scratchy bedding, and a soundtrack of pigs snoring under the table, it's a miracle they slept at all. Speaking of bedding, let's talk about the medieval bed. Modern mattresses are designed to cradle you in memory foam luxury, promising things like pressure point relief and cooling gel layers. Medieval peasants had what we can politely call an organic sleep experience. The average bed for the working class was a pallet, essentially a sack filled with straw. If you couldn't afford a sack, you just threw straw on the floor and called it a night. And that straw, it was great at insulating against the cold, and equally great at hosting a thriving community of lice, fleas, and the occasional rodent. If you were slightly better off, you might raise your pallet onto a wooden frame. This didn't make it softer, but it did mean fewer surprise beetles crawling into your ear at 3 a.m. Linens were rare luxuries. And pajamas didn't exist. You slept in whatever clothes you wore during the day. Entire families often slept in the same bed or in the same room, including grandparents, children, and the occasional cousin who overstayed their welcome. Personal space wasn't a priority. Warmth was. Now, if you were a noble, you slept in style. Large wooden bed frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, heavy curtains to block the draft, the works. Beds were so valuable that they would pass down in wills, like to my eldest son, I leave my lands and titles, and to my daughter, I leave the feather bed with only a mild goose odor. Still, even noble beds weren't free of pests. So those silk sheets sometimes came with a side of itchy realism. Another must-have for surviving medieval nights was the nightcap, and I don't mean a drink before bed. This was an actual cap, worn to keep your head from freezing while you slept. Medieval houses weren't insulated, windows were covered in thin parchment or horn, and central heating was just a dream. A good nightcap could mean the difference between sleeping soundly and waking up with frost forming on your eyebrows. The most iconic versions were long and pointed, making you look like a wizard whose main magic trick was not dying of hypothermia. Nightcaps came in wool, linen, or whatever warm fabric you could spare. For men, it was a practical accessory. For women, it sometimes doubled as a head covering for modesty, because apparently, even in your dreams, you could never be too proper. In towns, a nightcap could signal that you were off duty. If someone knocked on your door and you answered wearing one, it was the medieval equivalent of saying, "This conversation is over before it starts." Of course, what you wore to bed was one thing, where you slept was another. For travelers, inns were the medieval version of budget hotels, except with fewer amenities and more strangers in your bed. Rooms were rare, so you were usually assigned a spot in a bed already occupied by one or more people you'd never met. Privacy was a luxury you didn't pay for. Warmth was what you got. You could end up in bed with a merchant, a monk, or a man with a suspicious cough, and nobody thought it was strange. It was efficient. And then there were the animals. In many peasant homes, livestock shared the same living space as the family. Dogs curled up by your feet, pigs might snore near the hearth, and chickens, well, chickens went wherever they pleased. This wasn't a medieval version of pet-friendly living. It was survival. Animals gave off body heat, and in an age before radiators, a big dog was basically a furry hot water bottle. Sure, you might wake up with a hoof in your face, or fleas in your blanket, but at least you weren't freezing. For the deeply religious, sleep came with spiritual preparation. Life was unpredictable, and death was never far away. Illness, fire, a bad winter, or just the fact that you were over 35 in the year 1250. People prayed before bed, not for sweet dreams, but for protection of the soul. A common prayer asked God to take your soul if you died before waking, which is comforting in the same way a legal will is comforting. Monks and nuns took it further, ending their day with the formal prayer service called Compline before going to bed in shared dormitories. That made modern hostels look luxurious. Dreams, too, were serious business. Medieval people believed dreams could be messages from God, warnings from saints, or temptations from the devil. A dream of fire might mean hell. A dream of water could be purification or drowning. If you dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, you probably needed both a priest and fewer onions before bed. Your actions in dreams were thought to reflect the state of your soul, so even your subconscious could get you into trouble. Some dreams were written down and analyzed like divine puzzles, while others were quietly ignored, especially if they were the result of sleeping too close to the fireplace smoke. So yes, weird doesn't even begin to cover medieval sleep habits. Between segmented sleep, scratchy straw beds, bed sharing with strangers, livestock as heating devices, wearing wizard-like hats to bed, and worrying about whether your dreams were a trap from Satan, the Middle Ages turned bedtime into something halfway between a survival exercise and a theological exam. And that's just the basics. Things get even stranger when you look at the sleep habits of monks, traveling nobles, and the occasional king who insisted on sleeping surrounded by guards. Because, in the medieval world, sleep wasn't just rest. It was a nightly ritual of faith, survival, and compromise. And somehow, despite all that, people still managed to dream. Now, if you think peasants had it rough, monks in medieval monasteries would like to politely disagree, mostly because they considered rough to be the goal. Comfort was suspicious, luxury was dangerous, and soft pillows, temptations of the flesh. A typical monastic dormitory was not a cozy place to rest your head. Imagine a single large room lined with rows of wooden platforms or narrow benches, each with just enough space to lie down if you were careful not to roll over. Your mattress, if the abbey was feeling generous, was a thin layer of straw that had seen better harvests. Your blanket was whatever wool you could spare from freezing in the daytime. The rule of Saint Benedict stressed simplicity, and that meant no frills, no pillows, no privacy curtains, and definitely no late-night whispered conversations about the cute pilgrim you saw in the chapel. The idea was to train the body and soul to endure hardship. You slept in your robe, belt, and sometimes sandals, partly because midnight prayers were non-negotiable, and partly because removing layers might imply you cared too much about comfort. At the sound of the bell, often around 2 a.m., everyone rose for the first prayer service of the day. Matins pictured dozens of drowsy men or women shuffling into the chapel by candlelight, chanting psalms in the icy dark, their breath visible in the air. When you returned to bed afterward, you didn't complain. Well, you didn't say you were complaining. Silence was also a rule. Even outside monasteries, nighttime was a busy time for superstition. Medieval people believed the night was when the veil between worlds grew thin. If you woke during the watch period between first and second sleep, you might find it a good moment for prayer, or for checking the shadows for signs of trouble. Certain hours of the night were thought to be more spiritually dangerous than others, the so-called witching hours, when demons could slip into dreams or sickness might strike without warning. To guard against these dangers, people used charms or rituals before bed. A sprig of rosemary under the pillow could keep away nightmares. A cross above the bed might protect against evil spirits. In some parts of Europe, people marked their bed frames with holy symbols, not just for decoration, but because they genuinely feared that an unguarded sleeper was fair game for whatever was lurking out there in the dark. Insomnia that was treated with a mixture of faith, folk medicine, and questionable recipes. Some recommended warm milk mixed with herbs, like valerian or poppy effective, but possibly potent enough to keep you asleep until the next harvest. Others suggested bathing the feet in warm water, saying prayers, and imagining yourself walking slowly through a meadow. If that failed, there was always the option of a drink laced with honey and ale, which, while not medically ideal, probably knocked you out one way or another. For nobles, nighttime could be as much about display as it was about sleep. In grand castles, a lord or lady might have an elaborate bedchamber, complete with tapestries to trap heat, a massive four-poster bed, and sometimes a second smaller bed within the same room called a truckle bed for servants or guards. Sleeping alone was rare. Even kings preferred to have attendants nearby, partly for protection, partly to fetch things, and partly because cold stone walls don't care about your royal title. Some monarchs developed peculiar sleeping habits that baffled their subjects. One was known to keep candles burning all night for fear of assassins. Another insisted on sleeping in full armor before a battle. And there's at least one recorded nobleman who demanded his bed be moved every night to prevent enemy sorcerers from finding him in his sleep. Whether this worked is debatable, but it certainly kept the servants busy. Travelers, too, had their own share of strange arrangements. If you were wealthy, you might travel with a collapsible bed, essentially a portable frame with ropes or leather straps to support a mattress. But for most, bed meant whatever was available. A spot on the floor of a common room, a space in a hayloft, or even a cleared patch in a barn. Sleeping in the same room as strangers was so normal that people developed strategies for it. You might sleep with your purse tied to your wrist, keep your boots under your head, or, if you were particularly cautious, sleep sitting up against the wall with your cloak wrapped around you. Then there were the remedies for disturbing dreams. If you dreamt of something ominous, a dark figure, a raging fire, or your neighbor's goat speaking Latin, you might confess it to a priest the next day. In some cases, you might be told to fast, give alms, or avoid certain foods. The belief that dreams could foretell illness or disaster was widespread. Entire dream interpretation manuals existed, offering explanations for everything from dreaming of bread, good fortune, to dreaming of your teeth falling out, death of a family member, or possibly just bad dentistry. For children, bedtime was a mix of comfort and fear. Parents told them angels were watching over them, which sounds sweet until you realize it was also a warning. Behave, even in your dreams. Lullabies often contained moral lessons, and the concept of a bedtime story could easily veer into cautionary tales about thieves, witches, or the dangers of wandering outside at night. If that didn't keep them in bed, the family dog parked across the doorway certainly would, by now. You can see that medieval sleep was far from the peaceful, uninterrupted rest we might imagine. It was layered with ritual, superstition, practical survival strategies, and a willingness to accept discomfort as part of life. You weren't just lying down for 8 hours. You were entering a world where faith guarded your soul. Animals guarded your feet, and the cold guarded nothing at all. And yet, people adapted. They built their nights around the rhythm of segmented sleep, turned the midnight watch into a time for work or devotion, and accepted that sometimes you'd wake with straw in your hair and a chicken staring at you. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Which raises a question. In a world without clocks, electric lights, or heated blankets, how exactly did they decide it was time to go to bed in the first place? That's where the story of medieval sleep gets even stranger, because for them, the night didn't start when you wanted it to. It started when nature, necessity, and sometimes the church bells said so. In our world, night starts when you glance at your phone, see it's already past midnight, and mutter something about just one more episode. In the medieval world, night began when the sun went down and the shadows swallowed up the last of the light. No excuses, no late-night social media scroll, just darkness. Without street lamps or glowing screens, you didn't need a clock to tell you the day was over. The arrival of night was a physical thing. The temperature dropped, the air dampened, and the world outside your door turned into a black ocean you probably didn't want to wade into. Town bells sometimes rang to mark curfew, not as a gentle bedtime reminder, but as an official order. Fires out, candles snuffed, doors locked. This covering of the fire was so common, it gave us the word curfew itself, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. It wasn't about being cozy. It was about survival. Open flames in wooden towns filled with thatched roofs were a disaster waiting to happen, and sleepy humans were not to be trusted. Once the curfew bell rang, you banked your hearth fire under a layer of ash so it would smolder until morning, then blew out your candles. If you needed light after that, you were either on important business or up to something suspicious. But not everyone got to settle in for the night. Certain jobs came alive after dark. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, carrying lanterns and sometimes making loud noises on purpose to remind you they were there. In theory, they were protecting you from thieves and fires. In practice, they were also keeping you awake, shouting the hour and weather like some medieval version of a very loud alarm clock you couldn't turn off. Bakers often worked through the night, so bread would be ready at dawn. Millers might grind grain under cover of darkness, especially if the day's work had been interrupted. In some towns, night soil collectors, yes, that means exactly what you think it does, made their rounds after sundown, emptying chamber pots and carting the results far enough away to avoid complaints. All of this meant that while most people slept, the night was still full of movement, muffled voices, and the occasional suspicious crash. Inside the home, the night was structured by necessity. Families might say evening prayers together before bed, but they didn't necessarily all sleep at once. Someone might stay up to finish mending a net, spinning wool, or preparing food for the morning. In winter, when darkness came early, people often used the extra hours for quiet work, the kind you could do by firelight without setting your sleeves on fire. The first sleep began shortly after this early nightfall, and if you were lucky enough to live in a community with a church bell, you might hear it again in the middle of the night to call the devout to prayer. In rural areas, you relied on your own internal clock or on animals. Roosters aren't exactly punctual, but they were as good as any human alarm clock in the dark. Of course, the medieval night wasn't just practical, it was also deeply symbolic. Darkness was often associated with spiritual danger, temptation, or the devil's influence. People believed that certain sins were more likely to be committed under the cover of night, which was why the watch period between sleeps was considered the perfect time for prayer. You were alert enough to focus, the world was quiet, and you could ask for protection before drifting back into second sleep. This mindset also influenced how people reacted to nighttime noises. Today, a creak in the house might make you think of bad plumbing. In the Middle Ages, it might make you reach for a cross, a candle, or a heavy stick, because it could be a thief, a restless spirit, or a demon paying an unwanted visit. Dogs were valued not only for warmth, but for their ability to bark at things that didn't belong. Even a pig snorting at the wrong time might send a shiver down your spine. Superstitions about the timing of night activities ran deep. Some people believed that being born at night gave you a certain temperament, often mysterious or unlucky. Others thought that eating too late could cause nightmares or open your soul to bad influences while you slept. Entire communities passed down rules about when to harvest, when to travel, and when to avoid certain paths based on the hour and the phase of the moon. And then there was moonlight itself, which was both friend and foe. On one hand, it made night travel easier, lit the streets for the watchmen, and allowed farmers to work late in the fields during harvest. On the other hand, some swore that sleeping in direct moonlight could cause madness, illness, or even death. Curtains, canopies, and bed hangings weren't just for warmth or privacy. They also kept you safely in the shadow. All these beliefs shaped when and how medieval people went to bed. But the most important factor was still the daily rhythm of work and survival. Farmers rose with the sun and slept soon after it set. Craftsmen and merchants might stay up a little later, especially in towns where evening markets or taverns gave people a reason to linger. But no matter who you were, the night was never wasted. It was a time for work, for devotion, for watching, and for preparing yourself to face whatever the morning might bring. Whether that was a long day in the fields, a market full of customers, or, if you were very unlucky, a surprise visit from the tax collector. So, while our modern nights are lit by screens and neon, theirs were lit by fire and stars, and governed by bells, curfews, and the constant awareness that the dark was never entirely safe. And yet, somehow, the medieval world found its rhythm in that darkness, shaping a sleep culture that was equal parts practical, superstitious, and strangely communal. If you think medieval nights were all about sleeping, praying, and listening for suspicious noises, you're forgetting the people who saw darkness as an invitation. Because while the respectable farmer might have been snoring after first sleep, others were just getting started. Let's begin with taverns, the medieval equivalent of your late-night diner, except with more mead, fewer menus, and a much greater chance of someone challenging you to a duel over a dice game. Taverns were officially supposed to close at curfew, but reality didn't always follow the rules. In small villages, the innkeeper might quietly keep a candle burning for regulars who just happened to wander by after hours. In larger towns, certain establishments were famous for ignoring the bell altogether. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with smoke from torches and the smell of ale-soaked wood. Musicians might play lutes, fiddles, or bagpipes, sometimes skillfully, sometimes like they were waging war on the instrument. Patrons drank, swapped gossip, and occasionally tried to outdo one another with outrageous stories. These late-night tales could range from the totally plausible "I caught a fish this big" to the fantastically absurd "and then the saint himself appeared, riding a flaming chicken." But taverns weren't the only places still awake. Seasonal festivals, fairs, and holy days often spilled into the night, turning streets into seas of lanterns, food stalls, and revelers. Candlelit processions wound through towns, accompanied by chanting, bells, and the occasional street performer, who probably hadn't slept in days. In some regions, nighttime dancing was a staple of celebration, a communal whirl of clogs and skirts lit by the flicker of torches. These events could blend right into the segmented sleep pattern. After first sleep, people might wake to find the festival still going, join in for a few hours, and then return home for second sleep before dawn. The medieval world didn't have to choose between being an early riser or a night owl. You could be both, in shifts. Of course, not all nighttime gatherings were cheerful. In the shadows of medieval society, there were also secret meetings, forbidden rituals, and activities you didn't exactly announce to the parish priest. Smugglers used the cover of darkness to move goods. Lovers used it to meet without prying eyes. And, according to some accounts, certain groups gathered for ceremonies the church considered heretical, if not downright dangerous. This danger was part of why nighttime was so heavily policed in towns. Night watchmen weren't just looking out for fires, they were also on the lookout for any suspicious group lingering too long in an alley. But even with watchmen, the streets after dark were far from safe. Robbery was a genuine risk, and without modern street lighting, you often couldn't see a threat until it was right in front of you. Meanwhile, in rural areas, nighttime entertainment often centered around the home or a neighbor's hearth. Families might invite others over for storytelling, music, or communal tasks like shelling beans or spinning yarn. These weren't just chores, They were social events, full of jokes, songs, and stories that ranged from moral fables to ghostly legends. Some of these tales served a practical purpose. They kept children close to the fire instead of wandering into the dark. And speaking of ghostly legends, we can't talk about medieval nights without mentioning the deep well of folklore tied to sleep itself. Dreams were thought to be more than just the brain's idle entertainment. They could be messages, warnings, or even spiritual attacks. A bad dream might be blamed on a demon sitting on your chest, which gave rise to the image of the nightmare as a literal creature. To ward off such beings, people sometimes placed knives under their pillows, not for stabbing but as symbolic protection. Even animals got wrapped into these beliefs. Cats were sometimes allowed into bedrooms because they were thought to keep away evil spirits, although in other places, cats were suspected of being the spirits themselves. Dogs, with their keen senses, were nighttime sentinels. Horses were believed to be able to see supernatural beings, and if yours was sweating and trembling in the morning, some would swear it had been ridden by a ghost during the night. Not all beliefs were fearful. Some saw dreams as opportunities to glimpse the future or speak with saints. Pilgrims might sleep in churches or at the tombs of holy figures, hoping for visions that would guide them. This practice, called incubation, was a blend of faith, hope, and the belief that sleeping in sacred spaces could open you to divine messages. Whether those visions came from God, the subconscious, or the extremely hard floor is still up for debate. Now, you might be wondering, with all this activity, when did medieval people actually rest? The answer is that rest was woven into life differently. Daytime naps were common, especially for those who had been up late for work, prayer, or a suspiciously long tavern visit. Farmers might doze in the fields during harvest breaks. Monks might catch short sleeps between the multiple prayer services they were required to attend. Sleep wasn't a single block of time. It was a resource to be managed. And yet, despite the constant interruptions, many medieval people may have been better rested than we think. Without artificial light disrupting circadian rhythms, the body could follow the natural cues of sunset and sunrise. Segmented sleep allowed for periods of deep rest, wakefulness, and a second stretch of dreaming, a rhythm that some modern researchers suggest might actually be closer to our natural state than the continuous 8 hours we strive for today. In the glow of the hearth or the cold of a stone chamber, under a canopy of stars or the low roof of a thatched cottage, medieval people navigated the night with a mix of practicality, faith, and imagination. They built routines that balanced safety with community, and even in their strangest habits, whether it was sleeping with animals, rising for midnight prayers, or telling tales until the second sleep, you can see the logic of a world that had to work with, not against. The modern world treats night as a challenge to conquer with electricity and caffeine. The medieval world treated it as a fact of life, sometimes dangerous, sometimes joyful, always full of possibility. And perhaps that's the most surprising thing. For all our advances, we still wrestle with sleep, still fill our nights with stories, and still feel that the dark holds something just out of reach. If the medieval night was a stage, then every person, animal, superstition, and sound effect had its place. By now, you've met the cast, the watchmen with their swinging lanterns, the bakers kneading dough before dawn, the farmers snoozing beside cows, and the neighbors who definitely swore the moon looked funny tonight. But to see the whole picture, we need to walk through one last full medieval night, start to finish, and notice all the strange small details that made it tick-dot the sun drops, slow as a candle burning down, behind jagged rooftops. Shadows stretch long and thin across the cobbled streets until they vanish altogether. In the marketplace, last-minute bargains are shouted over the sound of carts being pulled away. The smell of roasting meat still hangs in the air, tangled with the sharper scent of fresh straw. And then the curfew bell, a deep, heavy clang that rolls like a drumbeat over the rooftops. It's not a suggestion. It's the medieval version of your phone alarm. People move quickly now. Fires covered with ash so they don't spark a blaze, shutters pulled tight, and candles snuffed to save precious wax. You can hear wooden latches clunking shut, the sharp hup of someone shooing a goat out of the doorway, and the tired sigh of a miller hanging up his apron. Inside, the world is dim but not entirely dark. In one small home, a mother is telling her children a story by the hearth, a cautionary tale, involving a fox, a bag of flour, and a moral that may or may not make sense. In another, an apprentice is secretly repairing a broken shoe by candlelight, hoping the master doesn't notice the leather he borrowed. Across the street, a merchant counts coins, their clink echoing in the stillness. Outside the town gates, farmers finish their rounds. Chickens are already tucked into coops, sheep huddle close for warmth. And somewhere a pig makes the kind of snort that sounds suspiciously like a complaint. A boy curls up beside the family cow, half for warmth, half because he knows nobody is going to steal a cow that comes with its own human guard. The streets aren't empty yet. The night watchman begins his slow patrol, lanterns swaying. All's well. He calls into the dark, though in truth he's keeping one ear open for trouble. A fire, or the sound of someone moving where they shouldn't. Not far away, the bakery glows faintly. The baker has been up since before sunset, kneading dough for the morning bread. His hands move in steady rhythm. The only sound, the soft slap of dough against the wooden table. Then the first stretch of sleep begins. In most homes, bodies are curled under wool blankets or, if you're wealthy, heavy quilts stuffed with feathers. The silence grows thick. Dogs stretch out near the hearth. Cats curl into themselves on rafters or stools, and even the horses in the stable stand still, eyes half closed. But somewhere between midnight and the small hours, the stillness cracks. Eyes open, doors creak. The in-between time has arrived. The space between first sleep and second sleep in one cottage. A man gets up to relieve himself in the chamber pot, and, since he's awake anyway, pokes at the fire until it glows again. His wife sits up, pulls a cloak around her shoulders, and reads from a small devotional book. A couple of houses away, two sisters whisper across their shared bed, gossiping about a neighbor's suspiciously well-fed chickens. Elsewhere, a shepherd slips outside to check his flock, lantern light bouncing off damp grass. Down an alley, a young man heads toward a tavern that accidentally left a light burning. Inside, the late-night crowd is small but lively. A pair of dice clattering across a table, a fiddle squeaking its way through a tune, and someone bragging about catching a fish as long as my arm, and that's without the tail. Not everyone's motives are cheerful. Some meet under cover of darkness to exchange goods without paying the market tax. Lovers slip away for hurried conversations in quiet corners. And in the priory, a monk is already chanting the night office, his voice echoing in the cold stone chapel, while the rest of the town goes about its shadowed business. This midnight pause is also a time for dreams to be dissected. If someone woke from a particularly vivid one, they might discuss it. Was it a warning, a blessing, or just the after effects of that questionable stew from supper? Dreams carried weight. A good one might be a sign from God. A bad one might need a charm or a prayer to undo its power. Knives under pillows, crosses carved into bedposts, or a sprig of herbs hung from the rafters, all small insurance policies against whatever roamed the dream world. Then, gradually, the world drifts back into second sleep. Fires dimmed to embers again. Outside, the only sound might be the distant splash of water from the mill wheel or the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Deep in this second stretch, dreams take hold, sometimes calm, sometimes chaotic, always taken more seriously than most of us would today, and then the faintest grey at the horizon. Roosters, wildly inconsistent, as always, start their crowing contest. The baker pulls fresh loaves from the oven, the scent curling through the streets. The curfew bell rings again, this time to mark the start of the day. By the time the sun lifts fully above the rooftops, the night has been neatly folded away. People open shutters, rekindle fires, and head to work. But the medieval night wasn't just a time to survive until morning. It was its own living rhythm. It held work, worship, secrets, and the kind of quiet that's hard to find now. We think of the past as silent, slow, maybe even boring. But if you had walked those streets after dark, you'd have found life in every shadow. A baker at his bench, a watchman on his rounds, a family huddled close telling stories, and somewhere, a lone voice in the dark calling, "All's well." And maybe if you woke tonight at 2 a.m. and just listened, no phone, no light, just the hum of the night, you'd find you're not so different from them after all. You'd think by now we've wrung every drop of story from the medieval night. But the truth is, the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. The night was a shifting landscape, part necessity, part ritual, part outright chaos, and every class, from the poorest field hand to the wealthiest lord, experienced it differently. So let's climb the social ladder for a moment. Start at the bottom. The rural peasant family, sleeping in a single-room hut. The floor is packed earth, the walls wattle and daub, and the bed is a wooden frame piled with straw. Everyone, parents, children, maybe even a visiting cousin, sleeps close together, partly for warmth and partly because there's nowhere else to go. The family pig might be tied near the door, snoring softly. The air smells of smoke, damp wool, and the lingering tang of dinner stew. In the middle of the social order, you've got tradesmen in small urban houses. They might have a separate sleeping chamber upstairs, reached by a steep, creaky ladder. Their beds are better, rope frames, mattresses stuffed with feathers or wool. Sometimes the ropes sag, so once in a while you'd hear the sleepy thump-thump of someone tightening them in the dark, which is where we get the old phrase, sleep tight. Then at the top of the heap, the manor house or castle. Here, sleeping is practically a public event. Servants might bed down in the hall outside the Lord's chamber. Guards sleep in shifts near the gates. And the Lord himself might share his bed with a favoured hunting dog, both for warmth and because a good hound was as valuable as gold. The mattress is thick, the sheets are linen, and the coverlets are embroidered with bright patterns. But the air still smells faintly of rushes, wax, and the last feast's roasted meat. Now, class aside, here's something universal. Night visitors. Not just the humankind, though you did have neighbours dropping by unexpectedly, but the unseen sort. People in the Middle Ages were convinced the night was thick with things you couldn't quite name. Witches, restless spirits, demons, The list was long. To guard against these, people relied on charms. A horseshoe nailed above the door, a Bible under the pillow, or a sprig of rue hanging from the bedpost could all serve as insurance against an unwanted midnight guest. And if you did wake to something strange, a noise, a chill, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, there was a proper medieval etiquette. Step 1, cross yourself. Step 2, mutter a prayer or a psalm. Step 3, if the noise continues, poke your spouse and say, "You go check." The in-between hours, between first and second sleep, were fertile ground for superstition. Candlelight flickered in odd ways, making shadows creep like slow-moving animals across the walls. Sometimes a knock on the shutter could send an entire household into whispered panic. Was it a neighbor in trouble, a thief, or something less explainable? Yet the same hours could be warm and communal. Imagine a midwinter night in a small village. The snow is piled high outside. The wind hisses against the shutters, and inside, half the adults are awake, sitting around the hearth in their cloaks. Someone mends a torn boot, another carves a wooden spoon, a jug of ale gets passed around, and before long, someone starts telling a story, maybe a saint's miracle, maybe a local ghost tale. These moments knit the community together as surely as any daylight work. Not all midnight activities were wholesome. The darkness was cover for petty crimes, poaching in the Lord's forest, smuggling wool past the tax collectors, or slipping into a rival's mill to borrow some grain. The watchman couldn't be everywhere at once, and the line between respectable citizen and mild outlaw was fuzzier than you might think. By the time second sleep rolled in, though the village settled again, sleep was heavy, deep, and often filled with dreams vivid enough to be remembered days later. People talked about these dreams over breakfast, which in medieval terms might be nothing more than bread and ale, and gave them weight. If you dreamt of water, it might mean change was coming. If you dreamt of fire, someone might warn you to watch for quarrels. When dawn finally broke, it wasn't just light that returned, it was sound. The first hammer blows from the smithy, the rattle of carts in the street, the crowing of roosters who had clearly been awake since forever. The town or village shook itself awake like a big, slow animal, and the night was done. But here's the thing. For medieval people, the night wasn't just an empty gap between workdays. It was its own half of life, filled with its own rules, customs, and adventures. You might go to bed a peasant and wake up, in your dreams, a knight in shining armor. Or you might just wake up with a cold nose, because the blanket had slipped to the floor. In our world of constant light and noise, we've lost that deep rhythm, the slow unwinding into darkness, the pause in the middle, the quiet return to sleep. But if you ever find yourself awake at 2 a.m., in that strange, still moment before the world begins again, maybe think of them, bakers, monks, lovers, thieves, all part of the same long chain of nights stretching back centuries, and maybe, just maybe, you'll hear it in the silence, the faint echo of a lantern swinging, boots on cobblestones, and a voice in the dark calling, "All's well." By now, you've probably realized the medieval night wasn't quiet, and it certainly wasn't boring. But if we pull back even further, beyond one village, beyond one century, you'll see just how many layers the darkness had, because in the Middle Ages, sleep was less about resting and more about navigating a world that changed completely once the sun was gone. Let's start with the cities. By day, they were a crush of markets, shouting merchants, and the constant jangle of cartwheels over stone. By night, they turned into something entirely different. The narrow lanes were shadowed and unpredictable. Here and there, a lantern burned outside a tavern or an inn, its flame dancing in the draught. The rest of the city, cloaked in black, except for the occasional glow leaking from a shutter. The watchmen here were more heavily armed than their village. Cousins, a staff in one hand, a sword or dagger at their side, and a set of keys for the city gates hanging from their belt. They didn't just patrol for thieves. They enforced the curfew, checked the taverns shut on time, and occasionally chased stray pigs back to their owners. City nights also meant more eyes, not all of them friendly. In the darkness, a pickpocket could melt into a side alley before you even realized your purse was gone. Then there were the night workers. Bakers, of course. They were the heartbeat of the pre-dawn city, their ovens glowing like small suns in the gloom. But also brewers, who tended to their barrels long after most people were asleep. And midwives, who might be called at any hour to attend a birth, making their way through the dark with a small lamp. Even the rat-catchers had their moment, prowling with sacks and sticks, trying to keep the vermin at bay before the market opened. Again now, step into the countryside, far from the city walls. Here, the night had a deeper quiet, broken only by the wind in the hedges, the hoot of an owl, or the far-off bark of a dog. Families locked their doors, simple wooden bars across the inside, and relied on the night watch in the nearest manor to sound the alarm if trouble came. Shepherds might still be out with their flocks, especially during lambing season, wrapped in cloaks and stamping their feet against the cold. But rural nights weren't all work and watchfulness. There were gatherings, small, secret, and often under the moon. Neighbors might come together for a bit of shared ale, music from a single fiddle, and stories that had been told so many times they were practically part of the landscape. The firelight would flicker against faces, making even familiar friends look like characters from some ancient tale. For the wealthy, the night brought different concerns. In castles and manor houses, light was a status symbol. The more candles you could afford to burn, the more impressive your household seemed. But candles were costly, and most nobles still kept to the rhythm of the two sleeps. Between them, they might read, play quiet games, or discuss matters of the estate. Servants would hover nearby, ready to fetch a warmed drink or stoke the fire. And then there were the truly strange habits. Some nobles slept in separate beds from their spouses, not because of marital strain, but because of the belief that too much shared body heat was unhealthy. In contrast, poorer families piled together so closely that turning over was a group decision. In both cases, people believed sleep posture mattered. Lying on your left side was thought to aid digestion, while sleeping face up was sometimes discouraged for fear that evil spirits could enter through the open mouth. Superstition didn't end when the eyes closed. If you dreamed of certain animals, a black dog, a snake, or a crow, you might wake convinced it was an omen. The response could be anything from visiting the local priest for a blessing to wearing a charm for the rest of the week. Some people even believed that sleeping in certain directions, head to the north, feet to the south, could influence what kind of dreams you had. Midnight also belonged to the healers and herbalists. They swore that certain plants gathered under moonlight had stronger properties, especially if harvested during the in-between hours. So you might glimpse a cloaked figure in the fields, snipping leaves by the pale glow of the moon, muttering words to bind the plant's power. But perhaps the most human thread through all these nights, whether in city or countryside, castle or hut, was the need for connection. The pause between sleeps was when secrets were shared, when disputes were mended or made worse, when plans were hatched, and sometimes when love quietly declared itself. The world felt smaller in the dark, the air thick with closeness, as if the boundaries between people were softer somehow. Eventually, the second sleep gave way to the same slow unfurling we've seen before. The roosters began their boasting, the bakers their clatter, the first pale light bleeding over rooftops or fields. And just like that, the night folded itself away until the next one, when the entire strange cycle would begin again. It's tempting to think of these people as impossibly distant from us. But if you've ever woken in the night, padded to the kitchen for a drink, sat in that quiet pocket of time when the world is still, you've touched the same rhythm. You've stepped into the same current they lived in centuries ago. And maybe, if you listened closely enough, you'd hear it, the far-off tread of boots on cobblestone, a voice in the dark, and the low, steady call, "All's well." If the medieval night was a world of its own, the winter night was its deep, slow beating heart. Everything about it, the long hours, the biting cold, the sharp stars hanging over silent fields, made the darkness thicker, heavier. And for most people, surviving those nights wasn't just about comfort. It was about making it to spring. In winter, the two sleeps felt different. The first was heavier, deeper, as bodies tried to recover from the cold workday. The waking, in between, could feel longer, sometimes stretching into hours if the fire burned low and the frost crept in. People would heap more logs on the hearth or shuffle closer together under blankets. In the poorest houses, they might even keep livestock inside, not only for protection, but because a cow or goat gave off more heat than you'd think. Bedclothes in winter were a layered affair: linen shirts, woolen tunics, and thick socks, all worn to bed. Quilts, if you had them, were treasured, and some families used heavy woven rugs over the bed as an extra layer. Wealthier households had fur-lined coverlets, which were as much a display of wealth as they were a practical shield against the cold. But winter nights weren't all huddled misery. They were also the stage for the year's biggest celebrations. The weeks around Christmas and the New Year were filled with feasts, dances, and, yes, some very odd sleeping arrangements. Guests from far-off manors or villages would crowd into any available space, sleeping on benches, in corners, or even in the stables if the house was too full. It was noisy, it was chaotic, and it was a kind of joy, a break from the long, grey sameness of the season. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year, was a strange hinge in the calendar. People marked it with candles and fire, warding off the dark as much in spirit as in body. Old traditions mixed with newer Christian observances, so you might have a saint's feast and, not far away, someone quietly keeping an older custom involving evergreen branches or symbolic foods. Sleep on that night was often delayed. People stayed up late, telling stories or singing, as if daring the darkness to linger a little longer. During festival seasons, the boundary between waking and sleeping blurred even further. You might nap in the afternoon before an all-night vigil, or fall asleep in your clothes after hours of music and drink. The church calendar demanded certain late-night or early morning services, so it wasn't unusual to see people trudging through the snow to midnight mass, lanterns bobbing in the dark like slow-moving fireflies. And here's where medieval winter nights got even stranger. Cold weather dreams were sometimes considered different from summer ones. People believed the cold could seal a dream in your memory, making it more prophetic. So if you dreamed of a rich harvest in January, you might hold on to that hope until autumn. The same went for ominous dreams. A bad winter dream could haunt someone all year. The darkness also made thieves bolder. With longer nights came more opportunity, and the cold could be both an enemy and an ally. A frozen stream made for a quiet crossing into a neighbor's land. A heavy snowfall could erase footprints. This meant watchmen and night guards were extra alert in winter, stamping their feet for warmth while scanning the shadows for movement. And yet, the season encouraged generosity to neighbors, might share food stores, invite others into their homes, or send children to deliver warm bread to the elderly. Hospitality was a social duty, especially in the dark months, and refusing shelter to a traveler could mark you as cold-hearted for years. Inside the better-off homes, winter evenings were a kind of theater. Tapestries helped insulate the stone. Walls, candles were set in polished holders to double their glow, and the air was thick with the smell of spiced wine or honeyed ale. Music softened the hours, the harp, the lute, the low hum of voices singing carols or ballads. Sleep here was deliberate, almost staged. Beds warmed with heated stones wrapped in cloth. Blankets turned back for the master of the house like an invitation. For the poor, sleep was far less staged, but no less valued. The hearth was the center of the winter world, and it never truly went dark. Someone was always poking the embers, keeping them alive so the morning wouldn't start in freezing silence. Sleeping near the fire meant warmth, but also smoke, and there were always tales of people waking with coughing fits or dreams, filled with strange shapes from the shifting light. The festival season stretched far past what we now think of as the holidays. Twelfth Night marked the end of the Christmas festivities, but winter still had other saints' days and local feasts to break the monotony. Each brought its own excuse for gatherings, and with gatherings came disrupted sleep. Entire communities might stay awake for hours, talking, laughing, eating, and then collapse into bed well past midnight, only to wake late and scramble to catch up on chores. By late winter, the long nights began to weigh on people. Cabin fever was real, though. No one called it that. Tempers could fray, and the in-between hours of night was sometimes when disputes erupted, whispered arguments between spouses, muttered grievances between neighbors forced to share a roof for a festival. But just as often, those same hours brought moments of tenderness, a parent telling a child a story by the glow of the embers, or a group of friends quietly sharing a last drink before bed. When the days finally began to lengthen again, there was a kind of relief in the air. Sleep patterns shifted back toward the faster rhythm of warmer months, and the deep, slow pulse of the winter night faded. But the memory of those long hours, the warmth of shared blankets, the crackle of the fire, the distant echo of bells on a festival night stayed with people, woven into the fabric of the year, because in the Middle Ages the night was never just an absence of light. It was a place you lived in just as much as the day, and in winter, when that place stretched its borders and held you longer, it shaped who you were, your habits, your fears, your joys, if you listen for it. Even now, on a cold night with snow in the air, you might still hear the echo, boots crunching on frozen ground, the hiss of a log on the fire, and somewhere, far off in the darkness, a voice calling steady and low, "All's well." Not every medieval night was spent in the comfort of a familiar bed, or even in a bed at all. Sometimes you had to take the darkness with you, whether it was a merchant hauling goods, a pilgrim chasing holy relics, or a messenger carrying urgent news. Travel meant surrendering the safety of your home for whatever shelter the road could offer. And that shelter came with its own set of strange sleeping habits. Let's start with the medieval inn, or rather, the many shapes an inn could take. In a busy market town, an inn might be a sturdy timber building with a stable out back, a smoky common room, and actual beds upstairs. Beds, plural, but not necessarily private. Travelers were often expected to share them with strangers, a practice called hotbedding, not in the modern sense, but literally sharing the same mattress either at the same time or in shifts. Privacy was a luxury. Warmth and a roof were the priorities. In smaller villages, an inn could be little more than a room in someone's home, cleared of furniture to make space for weary guests. Here, sleeping arrangements were improvised. Blankets on the floor, benches pushed together, or hay in the corner. Payment wasn't always in coins. Sometimes a meal, a bit of firewood, or help with the next day's chores sealed the deal. Then there were the monasteries, which offered shelter to travelers, especially pilgrims. These stays came with rules, separate sleeping areas for men and women, early bedtimes, and a wake-up bell before dawn for prayers. You might find yourself drifting off to the smell of incense and the faint echo of chanting, only to be pulled from sleep in the dark for a pre-dawn service. But many nights on the road weren't spent indoors at all. If you were traveling through the countryside, you might camp in a barn, under a hedgerow, or beside a fire in the open air. Fires had to be kept low to avoid attracting unwanted attention, but they were vital for warmth and for keeping animals, both wild and not so wild, at bay. Speaking of animals, you were rarely alone. Horses, mules, and even dogs often slept close to their human companions, not just for practical guarding purposes, but for heat. Medieval travelers knew that a horse could keep you warmer than any blanket if you positioned yourself on the right side of it and out of the wind. Travelers also had to sleep with their belongings, literally. Coins tucked into boots, knives within arm's reach, bags used as pillows. The fear of waking to find your only possessions gone was strong enough to shape how you lay down for the night. Light sleep was common, and many people trained themselves to wake at the smallest sound. On dangerous routes, groups would arrange themselves in protective circles, with the most vulnerable in the center and the watch taking turns around the edges. Even in an inn, if you didn't trust your companions, you might wedge a chair under the latch or keep a candle burning low through the night. Then there were the seasonal quirks. In summer, long daylight hours meant travelers could push further, before stopping, sometimes bedding down at twilight in fields warm from the day's sun. But in winter, night came early, and finding shelter before full dark became a matter of safety. A wrong turn could mean sleeping in the open under freezing skies, which is why some travelers preferred to sleep in their boots, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. For pilgrims, sleep was often a communal, almost ritual affair. Long halls lined with mattresses or pallets would be filled with the sound of murmured prayers before the first sleep. Between sleeps, there might be quiet conversations, the trading of stories, or even singing. The road had a way of drawing strangers together, if only for a night. Some journeys had their own sleep superstitions. Merchants might avoid sleeping with their heads pointed west, believing it brought bad luck for the next day's trade. Certain roads had reputations for restless nights where travelers claimed they were plagued by strange dreams, noises in the dark, or an inability to sleep at all. Whether these were caused by local wildlife, bad bedding, or just nerves was anyone's guess. Food and drink also shaped travel sleep. A heavy meal in the evening could make for sluggish mornings, so many travelers preferred something light before bed: bread, cheese, a bit of dried meat. But there was one exception: a strong drink before sleeping outside on a cold night. Ale or mead was thought to warm the blood, even if in reality it just made people more likely to ignore the cold until morning. When morning came, there was no leisurely waking. On the road, dawn was the signal to move. Fires were stamped out, belongings gathered, animals fed and harnessed. For those in inns, you might be woken by the noise of the stable or the innkeeper banging on the door to clear the room for the next guests. In monasteries, the bell called you to prayer before you could even rub the sleep from your eyes. And yet, for all the discomfort, there was something about these nights that people remembered. A shared blanket with a stranger who became a friend. The flicker of a fire under a canopy of stars. The sound of the road settling around you, wind in the grass, the creak of leather, the steady breathing of animals. It was a reminder that medieval life wasn't lived in one place, one bed, or even one kind of night, because whether you were under a roof or under the sky, sleep was never just rest. It was a negotiation with your surroundings, a dance with trust and caution, warmth and cold, comfort and risk. And on the road, every night had its own story. Some told the next day, others kept quiet, as secrets between the traveler and the dark. If you step back and look at all the sleeping we've wandered through, the hearthlit cottages, the festival nights, the deep winters, the crowded inns, the open roads, you start to see that sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't one thing. It was 100 little worlds, each shaped by who you were, where you were, and what the night wanted from you. In a small village, the night was a community project. Doors were barred, shutters closed, and the whole place seemed to exhale. As the sun went down, first sleep pulled people under early, but the waking hours between those strange, quiet moments were often the time for whispered conversations, prayers, or checking the animals. Second, sleep came slower in winter, faster in summer, but always carried that sense of starting the day from a softer place. In the manor houses and castles, night was a display of control over darkness itself. Tapestries muffled the cold, servants tended the fires, and beds were like little fortresses of wood, linen, and fur. Sleep here could be staged and ceremonial, yet still subject to interruptions from feasts, vigils, or urgent messengers pounding on the gates. Festivals turned all that on its head. In the long stretch of winter celebrations, nobody seemed to sleep at the right time. Friends and strangers packed into any available space, bodies arranged wherever they fit. The night was noisy, full of music and heat and the smell of food, and when sleep finally came, it was more like collapsing than drifting off. People woke late, tangled in blankets that didn't belong to them, sometimes unsure whose house they were even in. On the road, sleep became survival. You took what you could get: a hayloft, a monastery dormitory, a circle of travelers under the stars. You learned to sleep lightly, with one ear open, your belongings close, and your boots never too far away. You might share a bed with a stranger one night and sleep in a frozen field the next. Each place had its own rules, its own risks, its own version of comfort, and through it all, the seasons kept their own rhythm. Summer nights were short and busy, winter nights long and heavy. The solstice was a turning point that people felt in their bones. Candlelight could make a January night feel almost golden, but the darkness outside the door was always waiting. thick, cold, patient. The church bells marked the hours even while the rest of the world slept. Matins, lauds, vespers, the monastic schedule cut into the night and reshaped it. Even in towns far from any abbey, people lived within earshot of some bell or another. A reminder that sleep was never entirely private. It was part of the community's clock, bending to the rhythm of the shared day and the dreams. Those were their own kind of journey. People believed dreams could be omens, warnings, blessings. A dream in winter might stick with you longer. A summer dream might fade with the morning light. Some wrote them down, some told them over breakfast, others kept them close, as if speaking them aloud might change their meaning. If there's one thread running through all these nights, it's that medieval sleep wasn't about finding perfect stillness. It was about adapting to the season, the company, the dangers, and the demands of the next day. A farmer's sleep was not a night's sleep. A pilgrim's sleep was not a lord's. But they all shared that strange middle ground between the waking world and the dream one, that half-lit space where the fire crackles low. The wind presses against the shutters, and you feel the hours sliding past. The Middle Ages didn't have street lamps to chase away the night, or phones to break it into fragments. The dark was deeper, the quiet heavier, and the stars sharper than most of us will ever see. But that also meant the night was something you could inhabit fully, not just something to get through, but a place to live in for a while. And maybe that's the real difference. For us, night is the absence of day. For them, it was its own kind of day, just slower, dimmer, and ruled by a different set of rules. It was a time for rest, yes, but also for work, for worship, for talking, for thinking, for moving between worlds in the space of a single night, so the next time you're lying awake in the small hours, think of the medieval villager stoking the fire between sleeps. Think of the merchant keeping a hand on his coin purse in a crowded inn. Think of the pilgrim drifting off to the sound of distant chanting, or the castle guard pacing the walls under a winter moon. They would have known exactly what you were feeling, the weight of the dark, the pull of sleep, and the sense that the night is never really empty. It's always holding something, a story, a secret, a moment waiting for you to wake. And when the first light of morning finally pushed the darkness back, they rose to meet it. The day began, the work started, and the night folded itself away, ready to return. The Middle Ages are long gone, but the night hasn't changed as much as we think. Somewhere, far from the glow of modern lights, it still feels the same vast, quiet, alive with small sounds, and thick enough to shape the way you sleep. And maybe, if you listen closely, you'll hear an echo from hundreds of years ago, the slow, steady rhythm of someone breathing beside a fire, the creak of a bed, the soft voice in the dark saying, "All's well."